In April of 1915, the rulers of the Ottoman Empire began to round up and slaughter Armenians, who were then living as part of that empire. Today, Armenia is a separate country, and the Ottoman Empire became the nation of Turkey. 100 years after what most scholars consider to have been a genocide, Armenia and Turkey have no diplomatic relations. And countries, including the United States and Israel, do not refer to the mass executions as indeed a genocide. So as Armenians mark the 100th anniversary this month of what they demand be recognized as a genocide, scholars, artists, and activists gathered here in New York City to commemorate the centennial at a conference called Responsibility 2015.
At this juncture, at 100 years, we feel it's very important that it's time to admit what was done. This is an enormous crime, one of the major crimes of the 20th century, and it needs to be acknowledged.
So often when we talk of a genocide, it's all about the numbers of souls who perished. But it's not just the souls that disappear, it's the stories. It's the family connections.
If you deny the Armenian genocide, if we can continue to deny what is a classic case of genocide, right, then we really are hindered in our abilities to prevent genocide in the future. And secondly, the idea is that if we are going to commemorate one genocide, right, in a way we're commemorating all genocides, right? And we have a responsibility, right, to prevent these horrors from occurring to even one single person again in the future.
Joining me now to talk more about the issue of genocide is Professor Alexander Hinton, the director of the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers University. Professor, welcome to you. Let me start with this question, and it sounds simple, but it clearly is far more complex. What is the definition, then, of genocide?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, and there's often a lot of misunderstanding about it. There's one operative definition that comes from the UN. They passed in 1948 the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, and that basically, it's a long definition, but it's the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, an ethnic, racial, national, or religious group. And then there's some subclauses, and that sort of gets to the gist of what we now popularly think of when we think about the definition of genocide. But for example, the person who founded the word genocide, who coined it in 1944, Raphael Lemkin, he had a much broader definition. And he, for example, included cultural genocide. So if you see what's taken place recently with ISIS, he would call that a case of cultural genocide. And so that's left out of the Genocide Convention. So scholars tend to use a much broader definition than even the UN one. But that sort of gets to the heart of what people think of when they think about genocide.
Let me ask you to give us a quick capsulization then of what scholars and historians agree upon in terms of what happened between the Turks, the Ottoman Empire, and the Armenians back in the era of World War I.
Yeah, well, I think if you took a map of the world and you charted out the people who don't think it's a genocide and the places where they don't think it's a genocide and the places where they do, I think virtually the entire world, almost everyone would acknowledge that it was a genocide. It's really, nowadays, you know, the Turkish government is the primary institution that denies it. The reasons they're given for the denial, sometimes it's that there were Armenians who were rebelling against the government, or that there were some.
So they've questioned whether it was indeed execution. They've said, well, no, we were fighting a revolution. How many, let me just ask you this question. Give me a range of numbers. What are we talking about here in terms of how many people died as a consequence of this?
Yeah, so, you know, people vary in the estimates, but at least 1 million, maybe 1.5 million people. Many of them were killed outright. Others were marched into the desert. The men were initially targeted, and then intellectuals. And then a lot of the elderly, women and children were marched in these horrible death marches out into the desert where they were starved to death. They suffered from the elements. Some of them, for example, Kurdish tribesmen would come in and take them away as wives. There was widespread rape, all sorts of forms of violence. It was awful.
I mentioned in the introduction that even with the passage of 100 years, there are countries that don't recognize this as a genocide. It's not that they're saying it didn't happen, but they're not recognizing it as a genocide. One of those countries is the United States, and one is Israel. That seems surprising.
Yeah, it does.
Why are they doing it? Why are they taking that position?
Yeah, I mean, I think politics, right? That's often the thing. So right now, geopolitically, Turkey's absolutely critical to the United States in terms of its relationship with the war on terror going on, what's going on with ISIS, Iraq, Afghanistan. And so the Turkish government has stated explicitly that, you know, effectively, if you recognize the genocide, then there are going to be consequences. So at one point, France, a few years ago, recognize the genocide. And immediately, one of the first things that happened is the Prime Minister said, oh, well, if you talk about this as genocide, then you have to acknowledge the genocide of the Algerians. But they also said we're going to withdraw, for example, diplomatic personnel, and there are also threats in terms of trade, so on and so forth. And for the United States, though, I think geopolitically it's absolutely critical to maintain good relations with Turkey at this moment in time. So President Obama in 2000, I believe it was 2008, used the word, when he was not yet president, he used the word Armenian genocide, and he stopped doing that.
As the 100th anniversary approaches, what should we be learning from looking back on this? Certainly 100 years ago, to the Armenians and the Turks, certainly throughout the course of the Holocaust during World War II. Are there lessons that we haven't learned yet that we need to learn here?
Yeah, well, I think one lesson, I mean, so what is the significance of the 100th? It's, there's a milestone, it's significant, but I always think, first of all, remembrance, to think about the people who died. Most of them died completely out of sight of the world. Nobody knows their fates. They perished, so we think about the people who died. But it's also a time for reflection. Why does genocide take place? What are the consequences? How can it be stopped? And I think to think about it as something that takes place far away, misdirects us. Genocide took place in the United States, of course, and there, in a sense, is a denial in the United States as well about what has taken place. So again, as we reflect about this, we can also be self-critical and think about ourselves and how we're implicated.
Professor Alexander Hinton, some fascinating and provocative echoes of something happened 100 years ago. Thanks for spending some time with us.
Yeah, thank you.